In the Mycenaean period, roughly between 1600 and 1100 BC, Athens was one of the significant settlement centers on the Greek mainland. Although it did not possess the same political and military supremacy as Mycenae or Pylos, archaeological findings prove that Athens was nevertheless a well-developed and organized city. Around the decade before Christ, a Mycenaean palace was erected on the prominent rock of the Acropolis, serving as an administrative center and residence for a local ruler. The palace was part of a larger fortified complex, protected by massive cyclopean walls similar to those in other Mycenaean cities. During this time, the Acropolis served not only as a center of power but also held religious significance. It is presumed that cults were practiced there early on, which were later developed further in the classical period. The city also had a well-organized economic life, reflected in pottery production, trade, and the expansion of trade routes. Unlike many other Mycenaean centers that were abandoned after the sudden collapse of the Mycenaean culture around 12,000 BC, Athens remained continuously inhabited. This indicates a certain stability in the region and laid the foundation for the city's later development into one of the most important centers of ancient Greece. The Mycenaean past of Athens also remained in the collective memory of the Greeks and was incorporated into mythological narratives and heroic traditions. Dark Ages. After the sudden collapse of Mycenaean culture around 1200 BC, not only Athens but all of Greece entered a phase of profound changes and uncertainties, which researchers refer to as the Dark Ages. This epoch, lasting approximately from 1100 to 800 BC, was characterized by a decline in population, the loss of written traditions, and the collapse of central political structures. In Athens, too, there was a decline in urban infrastructure. The Mycenaean palace on the Acropolis fell into disrepair and no new monumental buildings were erected. The complex administrative systems, which were based on Linear B script in the preceding period, completely disappeared. This led not only to the loss of access to knowledge, but also to the inability to centrally organize large political entities. Despite this general regression, Athens remained continuously inhabited, in contrast to many other Mycenaean centers. This indicates that there was at least a certain degree of stability here. Archaeological findings prove that simple settlement structures, burial grounds, and modest forms of craft production continued to exist. Particularly noteworthy is pottery production, which continued to be cultivated in Athens and found new aesthetic expressions in the so-called proto-geometric phase. Even though this period was long considered culturally stagnant, it prepared the ground for the developments of the Archaic period. Oral tradition became more important, contributing to the emergence of epic poetry such as the works of Homer. At the end of this epoch, the first political structures began to form again, leading in Athens to the emergence of noble families and a new social order. Archaic period. In the Archaic period, which extends approximately from 800 to 500 BC, Athens began to develop from a settlement under the rule of local noble families into one of the most important polis, city-states of ancient Greece. This phase was characterized by profound political, social, and cultural upheavals that laid the foundation for Athens' later Golden Age. Initially, the political order in Athens was strongly influenced by aristocratic families who divided power among themselves through birth and wealth. These so-called eupatrids held the most important offices, including that of archon, and dominated the Areopagus, the city's council at the time. The broad masses of the population, especially small farmers, had little influence on political decisions and increasingly suffered from debt. In view of growing social tensions, the legislation of Draco around 621 BC represented a first attempt to create legal certainty. However, Draco's laws were considered extremely harsh and could not solve the social problems. A turning point came with the reforms of Solon around 594 BC. Solon carried out comprehensive reforms. He abolished debt slavery, divided citizens into four classes based on their wealth, and allowed the lower classes a certain degree of political participation, for example in the popular court and the popular assembly. These reforms laid the foundation for further democratization steps, even if political power initially remained in the hands of the wealthy classes. At the same time, trade, crafts, and culture flourished in the Archaic period. Athens established far-reaching trade contacts in the Mediterranean, which not only brought economic prosperity but also promoted the exchange of ideas and cultural influences. During this time, a more unified Greek identity also developed, partly through the introduction of common script, the Greek alphabet, the establishment of public sanctuaries and festivals, and through the spirit of competition at events like the Olympic Games. In Athens itself, the expansion of urban infrastructure began. The first monumental buildings were erected on the Acropolis. The Archaic period was thus a phase of transformation for Athens, from an aristocratically dominated city to a polis that showed the first democratic features and established itself as a rising power in the Greek world. Legislation of Draco in 621 BC. In Athens, a significant step was taken towards the development of a legally ordered state system in 621 BC. The legislator Draco was commissioned to record the previously orally transmitted laws in writing and make them publicly accessible. This step was a response to increasing social tensions and dissatisfaction among the population, especially among the poorer classes, who felt disadvantaged by the aristocratic upper class and had no access to legal equality. Draco's legislation was revolutionary in that it made the legal system transparent and counteracted the arbitrariness of aristocratic judges. For the first time, citizens could refer to fixed, written rules. The laws were allegedly written on wooden tablets, axons, and displayed in publicly accessible spaces so that everyone could see them. A milestone on the path to the rule of law. However, Draco became famous primarily for the extreme harshness of his laws. Even minor offenses were punishable by death, which later led to the proverbial expression draconian punishment. For example, theft was reportedly punishable by death. Although this excessive severity caused a great sensation among the population, it could not permanently resolve the social tensions. Despite its harshness, Draco's legislation contributed to the creation of a binding legal framework and marked a first step towards a formalized, publicly accessible legal system. His laws were later largely repealed or reformed by Solon. However, the idea of a unified legal order applicable to all remained a central element of Athens' further political development. Reforms of Solon in 594 BC. In 594 BC, the Athenian statesman Solon took on the task as archon to solve the political and social problems of Athens, which were exacerbated by social tensions and inequality between the various classes. At this time, Athens was marked by deep social and economic crises, as poor farmers fell into high debt and many were sold into slavery to pay off their debts. Solon introduced a series of far-reaching reforms that strengthened both the political structure of Athens and social justice, serving as the basis for the later development of Athenian democracy. A central component of his reforms was the abolition of existing debt slavery. Solon declared that no one could be sold into slavery to pay off debts, and he enacted a debt relief measure, seisechtheia, which canceled many debts and freed those affected from slavery. This measure helped to mitigate social tensions and create a fairer foundation for society. Solon also introduced a fundamental restructuring of society. He divided the population into four classes based on wealth rather than birth. The first class consisted of the richest citizens who had the highest political influence, while the poorest citizens who owned little to no land were placed in the fourth class. This also allowed less wealthy citizens to become politically active, as they now had a voice in the popular assemblies, ecclesia, and judicial proceedings, heliaia, although they could not be directly elected to the highest offices. Another important aspect of Solon's reforms was the introduction of a new, fairer legal system. Solon created a collection of laws that unified criminal prosecution and made jurisprudence less arbitrary. His laws were written down so that citizens had access to the rules and could refer to them, which contributed to the creation of a fairer legal system. Furthermore, Solon promoted economic development by supporting agriculture and crafts, facilitating trade, and enabling Athenians to access trade and economic opportunities throughout the Greek world. This strengthened Athens economically and laid the groundwork for the city's growth as an important commercial and cultural center in antiquity. Despite the profound changes Solon implemented, not all of his reforms were immediately accepted, and many problems remained unresolved. His attempts to reduce social inequality could not fully resolve the conflicts in society, leading to further political tensions. Nevertheless, Solon's reforms laid the foundation for the later development of a democracy, which was further expanded under Cleisthenes and Pericles. In this sense, Solon is considered one of the most important precursors of Athenian democracy. Tyranny of Pisistratus. Pisistratus, who ruled as tyrant of Athens from 561 to 527 BC, was a central figure in the city's political development and played a key role in transforming ancient Athens. Although he came to power through his rule as a tyrant, a form of autocracy without democratic legitimacy, his rule also brought many positive changes to Athens, fostering both the city's cultural flourishing and economic prosperity. Pisistratus seized power after several attempts to assert himself, capitalizing on the instability and political divisions in Athens. In 561 BC, after several failed attempts, he managed to conquer the city and establish himself as sole ruler. He proceeded skillfully by allying himself with various social groups, such as the poor farmers who were disadvantaged by Athens' oligarchic elites. The rule of Pisistratus brought with it a number of important reforms that not only increased the city's prosperity, but also its cultural significance. A central aspect of his policy was the promotion of agriculture and support for the lower social classes. He introduced measures that benefited farmers by allocating land to them and improving economic conditions for the poor population. By promoting agriculture, Pisistratus strengthened Athens' economic base and helped establish the city as a commercial and economic center. Another important part of his rule was cultural and artistic growth. Pisistratus was a great patron of art and culture, and under his rule Athens experienced a cultural flourishing. He initiated numerous public building projects, including the expansion of the Temple of Athena on the Acropolis, which later became known as the Parthenon. Performing arts and theater also flourished under his rule. Pisistratus promoted theatrical performances, and it is believed that he organized the first Dionysian festival, which laid the foundation for the development of Greek tragedy. In addition to his cultural patronage, Pisistratus also implemented administrative and infrastructural measures that improved social life in Athens. He carried out reforms in the area of infrastructure, such as the expansion of roads and the improvement of water supply, which contributed to the development of urban infrastructure. This facilitated trade and contributed to the city's economic expansion. Although Pisistratus brought about a variety of positive changes, his rule was not undisputed. He ruled with an authoritarian hand and asserted himself against his political opponents by marginalizing the aristocratic elites. This led to tensions within society, and when Pisistratus' rule was continued by his sons after his death, another political upheaval eventually occurred. The tyranny of the Pisistratids ended with the expulsion of his sons, and Athens experienced a transition towards a more democratic form of government. Nevertheless, Pisistratus left a significant legacy, particularly in the areas of culture and infrastructure. Many of his reforms laid the groundwork for Athens' later development as one of the most important cities of the ancient world, both politically and culturally. The rule of Pisistratus shows how a tyrant, despite his authoritarian rule, can provide essential positive impulses for the development of a city. In Athenian history, his era will be remembered as a period of cultural flourishing and economic stability that paved the way for the democratic reforms of the subsequent period. Introduction of democracy by Cleisthenes. Cleisthenes, an Athenian statesman, is considered the father of democracy in Athens, as he carried out a series of reforms around 508 BC that are regarded as the beginning of Athenian democracy. These reforms laid the foundation for the political system that later made Athens one of the most important democratic states in the ancient world. Before Cleisthenes' reforms, Athens was dominated by an oligarchic and aristocratic government, where power lay in the hands of a few wealthy and influential families. Political life was heavily influenced by the ruling noble clans who maintained their power in the city, and the majority of the population had little influence on the government. This situation in Athens was accompanied by social tensions and political instability, which was exacerbated by the role of tyrants such as Pisistratus and his sons. Cleisthenes' reforms followed the expulsion of the Pisistratids and the return to democracy. Cleisthenes, who belonged to one of Athens' prominent families, used this political opportunity to make fundamental changes to the city's political structure. His goal was to shift the balance of power by taking political decisions out of the hands of the old aristocratic families and placing them on a broader basis that included the less wealthy strata of society. One of Cleisthenes' central reforms was the reorganization of Athenian territory into 10 new administrative districts, the so-called phylli. These phylli replaced the old tribal structures that were based on aristocratic families and clans. Each phyle was composed of citizens from different parts of the country, so there was no longer a pure separation between city and countryside. This reform led to stronger integration of the various parts of Athenian society and reduced the influence of the old aristocratic families. Another important aspect of the reforms was the introduction of the so-called Bouleuterion, or the Council of 500. Cleisthenes created a new council consisting of citizens who were drawn annually from the various phylli. The Council of 500 had the task of preparing political decisions and setting the agenda for the popular assembly. The members of the council were chosen by lot, which abolished the aristocratic element of selection. This granted broader participation of citizens in political decision-making and laid the foundation for the later democratic control of the government. Cleisthenes also introduced a reform of the judiciary, strengthening the power of the popular assemblies and the popular courts. The popular court procedure was an essential part of Athenian democracy, as it gave citizens the opportunity to participate directly in the administration of justice. Citizens were selected by lot for juries, and these courts had wide-ranging authority to make decisions that affected the daily lives of citizens. This practice contributed to the political culture of Athens, where the people played an active role in decision-making. Another significant reform was the introduction of ostracism. This was a procedure by which citizens considered a threat to democracy could be banished from the city for 10 years. This was intended to prevent individuals or groups from becoming too powerful and sought to avoid political instability. Through these reforms, Cleisthenes created a system that extended political power to a broader segment of the population and laid the foundation for the later development of democracy in Athens. In contrast to the oligarchic form of government of the past, Cleisthenes granted citizens more say, which led to greater political participation of the population and paved the way for democracy in Athens. Cleisthenes' reforms helped to make Athens a place of free speech, political participation, and civil rights, and shaped the political system that was eventually seen as a model by other Greek states. Despite his significant reforms, Athens was not yet fully democratic. Only free men who were citizens of Athens had political rights, while women, slaves, and foreigners remained excluded from political life. However, Cleisthenes' reforms paved the way for the further development of democracy in Athens, which reached its peak under later leaders such as Pericles and shaped the political legacy of Athens for centuries. Persian Wars. The Persian Wars, which lasted from 490 to 479 BC, were a decisive chapter in the history of Athens and the entire Greek world. Athens played a central role in the struggles against the expanding Persian Empire, which, under rulers Darius I and Xerxes I, repeatedly tried to subjugate the Greek city-states. These wars were not only a military conflict but also a crucial moment in the emergence and consolidation of Greek identity and democracy in Athens. The first significant conflict within the Persian Wars was the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC. After the Persian king Darius I had undertaken an invasion of Greece, his troops landed on the coast at Marathon, about 40 km northeast of Athens. The Persian army was numerically far superior, and it seemed almost impossible for the numerically much smaller Athenians to have a chance against the Persians. However, the Athenian general Miltiades, who led the Athenian army, decided on a daring surprise attack. Through a tactically clever encirclement and a determined offensive, the Athenians defeated the Persians in one of the most decisive battles of Greek history. This defeat was a heavy blow for the Persian Empire and a decisive victory for Athens. The victory of Marathon symbolized not only the military strength of Athens, but also the resistance against external threats and the trust in democratic institutions and the common good of the Greek cities. After the victory at Marathon, Athens laid the groundwork for an increasing military leadership role in the coming years. However, the Persian threat remained, and in 480 BC the Persian king Xerxes I gathered a huge army and a massive fleet to finally subjugate Greece. Athens again stood at the forefront of the defense against the Persian attack. The decisive battle of this war took place at Salamis in 480 BC. After the Persian army had largely conquered Greece and destroyed Athens, the Greek fleet, consisting of ships from many Greek city-states under the leadership of Athens, faced a decisive battle. It was the Athenian statesman and Admiral Themistocles who played the decisive role by developing a plan to lure the Persian fleet into the narrow waters of Salamis. The Persian ships were larger and more numerous, but the Greek ships, especially the faster and more maneuverable triremes, could move better in the narrow waters and trap the Persians. In a daring and dramatic naval battle, the Greek fleet defeated the Persians, marking a turning point in the war. The victory of Salamis ensured that the Persian invasion was stopped and allowed Greece to regain the initiative. The defeat of the Persians at Salamis was a decisive moment for Athens and the Greek world, as it not only secured the independence of Greece, but also established Athens as the leading power in the Greek alliance. This victory strengthened the democratic spirit in Athens and contributed to the further development of Athenian democracy. In the years after the Persian Wars, Athens implemented a series of alliances and political measures that made it a hegemonic power in the Aegean. Athens' success in the Persian Wars also contributed to the formation of the Delian League, a defensive alliance that ultimately established Athens as the dominant power in the Greek region. The victory in the Persian Wars had far-reaching consequences for Greek civilization. It strengthened the self-confidence of the Greek city-states and solidified the idea of Greek identity. In Athens itself, this victory led to a golden age of art, culture, and philosophy, which became known as the Golden Age of Athens. The triumph of Athens in the Persian Wars also laid the foundation for the development of a democratic society that further expanded the political participation of its citizens and strengthened the importance of the popular assembly. Delianatic Sea League. The Delianatic Sea League was founded in 478 BC and played a decisive role in the political and military history of Athens and in the development of the Greek world after the Persian Wars. The original intention behind the Sea League was to ensure defense against the Persian Empire, which at that time was still considered a threat to the Greek city-states. However, over time, the League transformed from a defensive alliance into a political instrument that established Athens as the leading power in the Aegean and beyond. The Sea League emerged after the decisive victories in the Persian Wars, especially after the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC. Although the Greek city-states had militarily defeated the Persians, the Persian Empire was still a potential threat, and many Greek states sought ways to protect each other and prevent further attacks. In response to this uncertainty, Athens and other Greek states founded the Delianatic Sea League, named after the island of Delos, where the alliance meeting and the temple in honor of Apollo, the patron saint of the League, were located. The Sea League initially consisted of a multitude of Greek city-states that joined forces to ensure a strong naval defense against possible Persian aggressions. Athens played a leading role in this, as it possessed the strongest fleet. Within this alliance, the member states were obliged to pay an annual contribution in the form of money or ships. Athens was responsible for the organization and leadership of the League and provided the largest number of ships. While the original intention of the Delianatic Sea League was purely defensive, the alliance increasingly transformed over time into an instrument that gave Athens a dominant position. Initially, the League was still relatively egalitarian, but over the years Athens took more and more control over the alliance by managing its finances and leading the military command. The member states, who originally insisted on equality, were increasingly forced to submit their independence and military decisions to Athens. Those who opposed Athens' leadership could be suppressed by Athens with military means, as was the case, for example, in the revolt of Naxos in 469 BC. Athens used the resources of the Sea League not only for defense against Persia, but also began to establish the League as the basis for its own hegemony in the Aegean and beyond. Athens had control over the financial resources of the League and used the money, which was originally intended for reconstruction and financing of the fleet, to enrich itself and further beautify the city. For example, parts of the money were used for the construction of the Parthenon and other monumental buildings that symbolized the power and wealth of Athens. In addition, Athens began to influence the member states it led economically and politically, which led to tensions within the League. Cities like Mytilene and Thassos tried to break away from Athens, which in both cases led to military confrontations and the destruction of their resistance. The Sea League increasingly became a kind of empire under Athenian control, which expanded its power through coercion, diplomacy, and military superiority. This led to increasing alienation between Athens and the other member states of the League, who felt like vassal states under Athenian rule. However, the Deleanatic Sea League was not only a military and political organization, but also a center of cultural exchange and economic development. Through the secure trade route that the League enabled, many of the member states flourished economically. Athens also used its control over trade and maritime infrastructure to further expand its cultural and economic dominance. Over time, especially in the 5th century BC, however, there was increasing rivalry between Athens and other Greek city-states such as Sparta, which led to the conflicts of the Peloponnesian War. The Deleanatic Sea League increasingly lost its importance during the war and ultimately disintegrated after Athens' defeat in 404 BC. Golden Age under Pericles. The Golden Age of Athens under Pericles, which lasted from approximately 461 to 429 BC, marks one of the most fascinating epochs in the history of the Greek city-states and Western civilization as a whole. Pericles, a leading politician and general of Athens, shaped not only the city's political structure, but also its cultural and artistic developments. This period is particularly known for the expansion of democracy, Athens' rise to a cultural and intellectual stronghold, and the construction of some of the most important buildings in Western architecture. Under Pericles, democracy in Athens experienced one of the greatest manifestations in its history. He carried out a series of reforms that further opened the political system and allowed for greater citizen participation. One of his most important measures was the introduction of compensation for public offices and participation in the popular assembly, which also involved poorer citizens in the political decision-making process. These reforms made it possible for a broad section of the population to participate in politics, which is considered the peak of Attic democracy. The citizens of Athens could now actively participate in deciding on laws and important political decisions. This period under Pericles represented a peak of political freedom that the ancient Greek city-states had not known until then. In addition to political reform, Pericles placed great emphasis on the development of art, culture, and architecture in Athens. This period, often referred to as the Periclean era, was characterized by an intense promotion of the arts. Athens attracted many of the best thinkers, artists, and philosophers, which contributed to the development of Western philosophy and science. The philosophy professor Socrates and the historian Herodotus are just two of the prominent personalities who worked in Athens during this period, and whose ideas and works laid the foundation for later philosophical and historical schools of thought. A prominent feature of Athens' Golden Age under Pericles was the construction of monumental buildings that are still considered symbols of ancient Greek civilization today. The Parthenon, built between 447 and 438 BC, is undoubtedly the most famous and important of these buildings. This temple, dedicated to the goddess Athena, the patron goddess of Athens, stands as a masterpiece of Doric architecture and represents the artistic and cultural heritage of Greek antiquity. The Parthenon is not only an architectural masterpiece, but also a symbol of the power and glory of Athens. Its construction was intended to express the city of Athens' will to victory as well as its religious devotion to Athena. But the Parthenon was not the only impressive building created during Pericles' tenure. Under his leadership, the Temple of Hephaestus, the Odeon of Pericles, and the famous Athena Agora were also redesigned. The construction of these monumental structures not only changed the cityscape of Athens, but also helped to strengthen the city's political and religious identity. Athens became a center of art, culture, and knowledge that not only dominated the Greek world, but also radiated far beyond the borders of Greece. The promotion of art and culture under Pericles extended not only to architecture, but also to visual arts and literature. Many of the great Greek poets and dramatists such as Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Euripides experienced their heyday during this period. The theater in Athens became a central part of public life and played a significant role in religious and political practice. Pericles also promoted the development of sculptures, and many of the sculptures created during his reign are still known today as masterpieces of Greek art. During this time, Athens experienced not only a cultural flourishing but also enormous economic growth. Through the Delian League, which Athens founded after the Persian Wars, the city controlled most of the maritime trade in the Aegean and had become one of the wealthiest cities in Greece. The income from the contributions of the League members and from trade enabled the construction of monumental buildings and the financing of cultural projects. This prosperity allowed Athens to remain the center of the Greek world and to further expand its cultural and political hegemony. Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War, which lasted from 431 to 404 BC, was a decisive conflict between two of the most powerful city-states of ancient Greece, Athens and Sparta. The war was not only a military conflict but also a struggle for supremacy in the Greek world. It marked the end of Athens' golden age and brought far-reaching changes to the political landscape of Greece. The origin of the Peloponnesian War lay in the tensions and rivalries between Athens and Sparta and their respective allies. Athens, during the 5th century BC, had become a leading naval power, especially after its victory over Persia in the Persian Wars. Through the Delian League, Athens had built up enormous control over trade and a maritime empire which led to wealth and prosperity. Sparta, on the other hand, the center of military discipline and land power, led the Peloponnesian League, an alliance of city-states that saw Athens as a threat to their independence. Tensions between the two powers escalated in 431 BC when Athens and Sparta entered into open war. The conflict can be divided into three main phases: the Archidamian War 431 to 421 BC, the Sicilian Expedition 415 to 413 BC, and the Ionian War 413 to 404 BC. The Archidamian War, named after the Spartan king Archidamus II, was the first phase of the conflict. During this period, the Athenians relied on their naval superiority, while the Spartans tried to exert pressure through direct invasions into the Athenian hinterland. The Spartans carried out several campaigns in Attica but could not achieve decisive victories. Athens, under the leadership of Pericles, pursued a defensive strategy, using its ships to maintain supplies and secure superiority at sea. In addition, the population of Athens remained within the city walls, while the countryside was regularly ravaged by Spartans in the summer months. The war dragged on for years and led to considerable losses on both sides, both military and economic. An attempt to end the war with the so-called Peace of Nisches failed in 421 BC, as both sides remained suspicious of the peace efforts. This led to a renewal of the war and even fiercer fighting. The Sicilian Expedition, which lasted from 415 to 413 BC, was a decisive phase in the Peloponnesian War. Athens, which still had a strong fleet, decided to launch a campaign against the city of Syracuse in Sicily. However, this attempt to expand Athenian power in the western Mediterranean ended catastrophically. The Athenian fleet was utterly defeated, and thousands of soldiers and sailors were killed or captured. This failure significantly weakened Athens and initiated a turning point in the war. The final phase of the war, the Ionian War 413 to 404 BC, was characterized by a gradual defeat of Athens. Spartan alliances with Persia gave the Spartans the financial means to build a strong fleet with which they could fight the Athenians at sea. Athens was now in a position where it had to fight against both the Spartans and internal political and economic difficulties. The war wore down the city, and a series of political crises, such as the introduction of an oligarchic government under the so-called 400 and the subsequent return to democracy, further undermined Athens' moral and political stability. The decisive moment of the war came in 404 BC when the Spartans, under the leadership of Lysander, defeated the Athenian fleet in the Battle of Aegas Potami. After this defeat, Athens was militarily and economically broken. In the same year, the Athenians gave up and Athens capitulated. The Peloponnesian War ended with a complete victory for Sparta, which now became the leading power in Greece. Rule of the 30 Tyrants. After Athens' defeat in the Peloponnesian War, an oligarchic group known as the 30 Tyrants seized power in the city in 404 BC. This rule was a direct consequence of the peace treaty with Sparta, which insisted that democracy in Athens be abolished and replaced by an oligarchic government. The 30 tyrants were installed under the leadership of Critias, a relative of Plato and a former student of Socrates. Although supported by Sparta, many of them came from Athenian noble families themselves. The rule of this group was characterized by political oppression, violence, and massive infringements on citizens' freedoms. They had numerous political opponents executed or exiled, expropriated wealthy citizens, and created an atmosphere of fear and arbitrariness. Their goal was to concentrate power in the hands of a small elite and suppress all democratic influence. Public offices were almost exclusively awarded to their own supporters, and special courts were even set up to eliminate undesirable opponents with show trials. Particularly problematic was that the 30 not only persecuted Democrats and political opponents, but also wanted to settle old scores, which led to a climate of mistrust and instability. Support from the Spartan occupation troops initially enabled them to secure their power. However, resistance to their regime grew rapidly, especially in exile. Numerous persecuted Democrats, including Thrasybulus, gathered in Thebes and began to prepare for the reconquest of the city. Already in 403 BC, an overthrow occurred. Thrasybulus returned with a small force, occupied the fort of Phyle, and finally marched on Athens. Despite the oligarchs' initial military superiority, the resistance pushed them back. In a decisive battle at Monicia in Piraeus, Critias was killed, and the power of the 30 finally collapsed. Subsequently, democracy was restored in Athens. The return to democracy was remarkable because it was not characterized by bloody revenge. Instead, the idea of amnesty prevailed. Many of those who had served under the regime of the 30 were not persecuted as long as they had not been involved in serious crimes. This decision contributed significantly to stabilizing the political situation and was an early example of reconciliation in a post-Civil War-like state. The rule of the 30 tyrants thus lasted less than a year but left a deep impression on the collective memory of the Athenians. It served in the future as a cautionary example of the dangers of oligarchy and strengthened popular support for democratic principles. This period was also intensively reflected and discussed in philosophy, particularly in the works of Plato, Macedonian rule. After the decisive Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, in which the troops of the Macedonian king Philip II defeated an alliance of Greek city-states, including Athens and Thebes, Athens lost its political independence and fell under the growing influence of the Kingdom of Macedon. This battle marked a turning point in Greek history. The classical era of independent polis ended, and a new era of Macedonian hegemony began. Philip II did not use the victory to completely subjugate Athens but pursued a more diplomatic strategy. He founded the so-called Corinthian League, which Athens also joined, albeit under the supremacy of Macedon. This league obliged the member states not to wage wars against each other and to join common military enterprises, especially the planned campaign against the Persian Empire. After Philip's assassination in 336 BC, his son Alexander the Great took over the rule. During Alexander's conquests against Persia and beyond, Athens remained formally autonomous, but its political decisions were factually severely restricted by Macedonian garrisons and influence. Athenian democracy continued to exist, but it was deprived of its former strength. Athens' freedom of action in foreign policy was practically non-existent. After Alexander's death in 323 BC, Athens made a final attempt to free itself from Macedonian tutelage in the so-called Lamian War. Athens, together with other Greek cities, led an uprising against Macedonian overlordship, but it soon failed. The defeat led to a further restriction of political self-determination. From then on, the Macedonian rulers increasingly appointed governors and military commanders in the city. In the following decades, Athens was repeatedly embroiled in the power struggles of the Diadochi, Alexander's successors. The city was now a pawn between various Macedonian dynasties, the Antigonids, Seleucids, and Ptolemies. Despite this political dependence, Athens remained an important cultural center of the Greek world. Philosophy, rhetoric, and art continued to flourish, and the academies of Plato and Aristotle had an impact far beyond the city. It was not until 197 BC, after the Romans defeated the Macedonians in the Battle of Cynoscephaly, that Macedonian supremacy over Greece finally ended. Athens was subsequently increasingly integrated into the Roman sphere of influence, which ushered in a new phase of history. However, the Macedonian period had profoundly changed Athens' political self-perception, from a leading polis to a city under foreign tutelage. Roman period. In 146 BC, Greece was officially incorporated into the Roman Empire after the Romans had broken the last major resistance of the Greek city-states in the Battle of Corinth. Athens thereby definitively lost its political independence, but was not completely subjugated or rendered meaningless. On the contrary, under Roman rule, the city was able to maintain itself as a cultural and intellectual center and even experience a certain boom. The Romans deeply admired Greek culture, philosophy, art, and science. Athens was considered the intellectual heart of the Hellenistic world to them. Many Roman elites sent their sons to Athens to receive a classical education there, especially in rhetoric, ethics, and philosophy. The schools of famous philosophers such as Plato, Aristotle, Epicurus, and the Stoics continued to exist and attracted numerous students from all over the empire. Politically and urbanistically, Athens also enjoyed a certain promotion under Roman rule. Numerous Roman emperors supported the city through the construction of temples, libraries, and other public facilities. Particularly noteworthy is Hadrian's library, which was built under Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century AD. Hadrian was a great admirer of Greece and visited Athens several times. He bestowed new magnificent buildings on the city and appeared as a benefactor. Despite the cultural flourishing, Athens remained largely excluded from political power during this epoch. It was now a provincial city in the vast Roman Empire, embedded in the system of provincial administration. Local elites were still allowed to hold municipal offices, but central decisions were made in Rome. A significant event was the Mithridatic War in the 1st century BC, in which Athens sided with the Pontic king Mithridates VI against Rome. As punishment, the Roman general Sulla brutally plundered the city in 86 BC. Many buildings were destroyed and Athens temporarily lost importance. Nevertheless, the city managed to recover over the following decades, not least thanks to the support of Roman patrons. Overall, the Roman period was a phase of change for Athens. Its political role waned, but its cultural significance remained. Athens became a kind of university city of antiquity, where the Roman world connected with the intellectual heritage of Greece. The city remained a symbol of classical education and philosophical discourse, a role it preserved until late antiquity, Byzantine era. In the Byzantine era, which extended from the 4th to the 15th century AD, Athens progressively lost its political significance, particularly in comparison to its glorious past as a leading polis in classical Greece. Nevertheless, the city survived and transformed into an important religious and cultural center within the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. After the division of the Roman Empire in 395 AD, Athens henceforth belonged to the eastern part of the empire, which soon established itself as the Byzantine Empire. At this point, the ancient city had already lost many of its former political and economic functions. However, its reputation as a place of scholarship and spirituality persisted, albeit under changed circumstances. The pagan character of classical philosophy was increasingly supplanted by Christian theology. In the 6th century, a decisive turning point occurred with the closure of the philosophical schools by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I in 529 AD. The centuries-old tradition of Platonic and Aristotelian teaching in Athens came to an official end. This meant not only the end of the ancient philosophical schools, but also a definitive shift of educational centers to Christian monasteries and ecclesiastical institutions. Despite these upheavals, Athens continued to develop, especially as a place of Christian piety. Numerous churches were built, many of them on or near the foundations of older pagan temples. Byzantine architecture profoundly shaped the cityscape. A prominent example is the Church of the Holy Apostles in the ancient Agora, which was built around the 10th century and still stands today. During the long Byzantine rule, Athens always remained on the periphery of major political developments. The city was plundered several times by foreign troops, for example by the Slavs in the 7th century. Nevertheless, it managed to maintain itself as an urban center, mainly due to its religious status and historical importance. Only towards the end of the Byzantine period, in the late Middle Ages, did Athens briefly regain political prominence when it fell under Latin rule in 1204 during the Fourth Crusade and later passed to the Duchy of Athens, ruled by Frankish and Catalan nobles. Overall, the Byzantine period was an era of cultural change for Athens. The glory of classical antiquity gave way to the religious significance of the Christian Middle Ages. The city endured wars, plunderings, and political upheavals not as a center of power, but as a living place with spiritual and historical depth. Ottoman rule. With the Ottoman conquest in 1458, a new phase lasting over 3 centuries began for Athens under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman commander Pasha took the city almost without a fight, and Athens was integrated into the administrative structure of the empire. Although the city did not play a prominent political or economic role during this time, it was nevertheless a regional center with a mixed population of Christians, Muslims, and Jews. In the beginning, the Ottomans showed some tolerance towards the local Greek Orthodox population, which was manifested, among other things, in the possibility of continuing to use or administer churches. However, many important ancient and Byzantine buildings were converted or damaged during this period. For example, the Parthenon on the Acropolis, which had already been converted into a church during the Byzantine period, was transformed into a mosque. Other classical monuments were either used as building material or repurposed for military use. During the 17th century, Athens was occasionally visited by Western travelers and scholars who rekindled interest in classical antiquity. The city was often described as a quiet but dilapidated place, whose great past stood in stark contrast to its modest present. The famous ruins deeply impressed visitors from Western Europe. Many of them were grand tour travelers, archaeologists, or artists. A particularly incisive event was the siege of the Acropolis in 1687 by Venetian troops during the so-called Great Turkish War. During an attack, the Ottoman powder magazine stored there exploded, causing severe damage to the structure of the Parthenon, a loss that is still considered tragic today. Throughout the 18th century, Athens remained a quiet provincial town under Ottoman administration. Nevertheless, a Greek national consciousness gradually developed, which grew in many regions of the Ottoman Empire and eventually led to the Greek independence movement. When the Greek Revolution against the Ottomans broke out in 1821, residents of Athens also participated in the uprisings. The city was repeatedly recaptured by Ottoman troops and besieged by Greek fighters. Only in 1830, with the international recognition of Greece's independence, did Ottoman rule over Athens end. The Ottoman period left a mixed legacy. On the one hand, it was an era of cultural and economic decline for the once so important city. On the other hand, despite all the upheavals, Athens preserved its historical identity. Many buildings survived in altered form, and the memory of the great past remained alive in the collective consciousness of the population. Greek independence. After the successful Greek War of Independence against the Ottoman Empire, which began in 1821 and ended with the international recognition of an independent Greek state through the Treaty of London in 1830, a new epoch began for the country. The young Greek nation now faced the enormous task of forming a modern state from a region that had been under Ottoman rule for centuries. In 1834, Athens was officially declared the capital of the new Kingdom of Greece. This decision was of great symbolic and cultural significance. Although Athens was at that time only a small, underdeveloped town with barely more than 5,000 inhabitants, it was considered the ideal center for the rebirth of Greek identity due to its glorious ancient past. The choice therefore did not fall on one of the larger cities such as Nafplio, the first provisional capital, or Patras, but on the venerable, historically rich city that had once been the heart of classical Greek civilization. The young Bavarian King Otto I, who was installed as the first monarch of modern Greece, had plans drawn up for the reconstruction of Athens. Under the direction of architects such as Eduard Schaubert and Stamatios Cleanthies, the city began to be redesigned along classical lines. Wide boulevards, squares, and neoclassical buildings were intended to recall ancient glory and at the same time form a modern capital. Numerous buildings that still characterize the cityscape of Athens today, such as the Royal Palace, now the Parliament, the National Library, and the University, date from this phase. The designation of Athens as the capital thus marked not only a political but also a cultural turning point. It initiated the rebirth of the city as a national symbol and represented the beginning of a phase of renewal and construction that once again made Athens an important center of Greek life in the course of the 19th century. Modern development. In the course of the 20th and 21st centuries, Athens has developed from a comparatively small capital into a modern, pulsating metropolis, which today represents the economic, political, and cultural center of Greece. The city underwent profound transformation processes, especially in the years after the Second World War, when rapid urbanization set in due to strong rural exodus and industrialization. Many people from rural areas moved to the capital in search of work and better living conditions, which led to rapid population growth. A significant milestone in the modern history of Athens was the hosting of the first Olympic Games of the modern era in 1896. These games were not only a sporting event, but also a symbolic act that underlined the connection between ancient and modern Greece and brought Athens into the global spotlight. The Games were mainly held in the Panathenaic Stadium, which was built on the remains of an ancient stadium and remains an icon of the city to this day. In 2004, the Olympic Games returned to Athens. this time as a major event with worldwide attention. The state invested massively in infrastructure, which led to the construction of new sports facilities, the modernization of the airport, the expansion of the subway system, and the improvement of road and traffic systems. These investments contributed significantly to moving Athens into the image of a modern European capital. Today, Athens is a vibrant city where ancient monuments and modern city life meet. It is characterized by a lively cultural life with theaters, museums, universities, and festivals, but also by social and political challenges. Despite economic crises, especially in the 2010s, Athens has proven to be resilient and adaptable. The city remains a fascinating example of the combination of historical depth and contemporary dynamism.